Wilbur Underhill Jr. was born on March 16, 1901, in Joplin, Missouri, a city that by the turn of the century had transformed into a thriving mining hub. Buried within the Ozark Plateau, Joplin's streets were busy with industry and opportunity, its population swelling with workers drawn to the rich veins of lead and zinc that ran beneath the rocky earth. But not all who came found prosperity. The Underhill family, like many others on the rougher edges of Joplin, found only hardship. Wilbur grew up in a large, impoverished household. His family struggled to make ends meet, and the chaotic nature of his upbringing left little room for guidance or comfort. The Underhills were no strangers to lawlessness. His older brother George had already set a criminal precedent by the time Wilbur entered adolescence, eventually being convicted of murder. That shadow hung over the family and especially over Wilbur, who came to see the world through a lens of survival and distrust. By his teenage years, Wilbur was already engaging in petty theft, burglary, and other low-level crimes. What started as acts of desperation soon turned into a way of life. School held no promise, and the promise of legitimate work faded under the weight of poverty and stigma. By 1918, he had been sentenced to prison for burglary. The Missouri State Penitentiary was his first taste of institutional life, a place that hardened men rather than rehabilitated them. He was released in 1920, but instead of reform, he returned to crime almost immediately. That same year, Joplin and surrounding communities became haunted by a figure known only as the Lover's Lane Bandit. Couples parked along secluded roads began reporting violent robberies. The attacker would appear from the shadows, gun in hand, and demand money, jewelry, or clothing. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was with a cold, commanding tone. The attacks were brazen and terrifying. Victims described the man as young, lean, and dangerous. It didn't take long before law enforcement suspected Wilbur Underhill. In October 1920, he was arrested and eventually convicted in connection with these crimes. His sentence placed him once again in the Missouri State Penitentiary. There, Wilbur evolved. He observed everything. He learned from seasoned criminals. He studied the routines of guards, the weaknesses of walls, the structure of the penal system itself. He began to understand how to manipulate people, not just through fear, but through charm and subtle pressure. Released on parole in 1926, Wilbur made no pretense of going straight. He traveled south into Oklahoma, where he reconnected with Skeet Akins, a fellow criminal with a similarly violent past. Together, the two plotted robberies throughout the region. On Christmas Day 1926, the pair targeted a drugstore in Okmulgee, Oklahoma. What was meant to be a simple armed robbery turned deadly when 19-year-old George Fee, an innocent customer, was shot and killed. The senselessness of the act shocked the community. Wilbur and Akins were arrested soon after, but they escaped from jail before trial. During the manhunt that followed, Akins was cornered and shot dead by law enforcement. Underhill, on the other hand, remained on the run for several months. He traveled across the Ozarks, evading capture using terrain he knew intimately. His time in hiding further shaped his paranoia and tactical mindset. He stayed in barns, caves, and mining shacks. He trusted no one. Eventually, in April 1927, he was captured near Panama, Oklahoma, after a shootout with law enforcement left him wounded. He was convicted of George Fee's murder and sentenced to life imprisonment at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. There, he became infamous for his multiple escape attempts. The prison authorities learned quickly that Underhill was not like other inmates. He didn't just fight the system, he studied it. In July 1931, after years of planning, he executed a successful escape. Hidden in a laundry cart that left the prison grounds, he slipped through the gates unnoticed and returned to the outside world. The escape was a severe embarrassment to the Oklahoma penal system, and his name quickly returned to headlines across the region. Once free, Underhill wasted no time returning to crime. In Wichita, Kansas, he became involved in a shootout that left patrolman Merle Culver dead. Underhill had been hiding in a hotel when Culver, responding to a tip, attempted to arrest him. Underhill shot the officer in the chest and escaped into the city, only to be captured 3 days later while hiding in a rail yard. Convicted again and sentenced to life at Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing, Underhill was transferred under heavy guard. But the prison could not contain him. Over the next 2 years, he quietly began building a new alliance behind bars. He formed relationships with notorious criminals including Harvey Bailey, Frank Sawyer, and Ed Davis. Together, they began plotting what would become one of the most daring prison breaks in Depression-era history. On May 30, 1933, the plan was set into motion. Using pistols smuggled into the prison by outside accomplices, allegedly with help from crime figure Frank Jelly Nash, the group stormed the prison powerhouse. The inmates overpowered the guards, took weapons, and opened gates. 11 men, including Underhill, Bailey, and Sawyer, escaped in a waiting car and vanished into the countryside. The escape was front-page news across the Midwest. The group scattered, but the alliance between Underhill and Bailey held strong. They regrouped in the Cookson Hills of Oklahoma, a known hideout for criminals. There, the Bailey-Underhill gang was formed. Over the summer of 1933, they carried out a string of violent bank robberies across Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. These included heists in Black Rock, Clinton, and Kingfisher. Each job was carried out with military precision. Underhill often took point, storming into banks with pistols raised, issuing commands without hesitation. They used stolen vehicles, lookouts, and quick escape routes to avoid capture. Law enforcement struggled to keep up. The FBI, still young and under-equipped, found itself repeatedly outmaneuvered. Local authorities were underfunded, overworked, and hesitant to pursue heavily armed fugitives. Rewards were offered, roadblocks were set, tips trickled in, but nothing led to their arrest. Then came the Kansas City Massacre. On June 17, 1933, in front of Union Station in Kansas City, Missouri, federal agents attempted to transport Frank Jelly Nash. Gunmen ambushed the officers, killing Nash and 4 lawmen in a hail of gunfire. The event shocked the nation. It galvanized public support for expanding federal power and triggered a sea change in American law enforcement. Though later evidence pointed to Vern Miller and members of the Barker Karpus gang as the culprits, Underhill and Bailey were immediately suspected due to their association with Nash and their recent escape. Underhill, already hunted for murder and robbery, now found himself accused, wrongly, of participating in a massacre that became the catalyst for arming FBI agents and allowing them to pursue fugitives across state lines. His legend grew, even as he became more isolated and paranoid. By the fall of 1933, the Bailey-Underhill gang had splintered. Some were arrested, others fled. Bailey was eventually captured in Texas. Underhill remained free, hiding in the woods and hills of eastern Oklahoma. He traveled alone, wounded and exhausted, robbing small businesses and living in abandoned homes. His health declined. His foot, injured during a previous escape, became infected. His mind, once sharp and methodical, was now driven by fear. He became more volatile, shooting at anyone he suspected of betrayal. His violence became erratic. Once careful and calculating, he now left behind evidence, witnesses, and chaos. Rumors of his whereabouts reached law enforcement, and in late December, a tip led federal agents to a house in Shawnee, Oklahoma. On December 30, 1933, a task force of 24 men surrounded the house. They waited for daylight, then made their move. The house in Shawnee, Oklahoma sat quiet in the early morning cold of December 30, 1933. Inside, Wilbur Underhill Jr. was nursing both wounds and memories. His body was failing him. His foot, once nimble and quick in the flight from lawmen, was now swollen from infection. His lungs were tight, his skin was pale. He had become the ghost that law enforcement described in their wanted posters. He had chosen this house on Bell Street because it belonged to people who owed him favors and who feared him more than they feared the law. He paid in cash and threats. No one asked questions. Still, he knew he couldn't stay long. But time had run out. Outside the house, a task force of 24 heavily armed federal agents, local police officers, and state troopers surrounded the property. They had received confirmation that Underhill had been staying there for several nights, and after weeks of pursuing shadows across the state, they were ready to end the manhunt. Shortly before sunrise, the lead agent issued a demand. He shouted for Underhill to surrender. There was no response. Moments later, a second call came, louder and more forceful. Inside the house, Underhill moved slowly toward the front door. He had 2 Colt pistols at his sides and a shotgun within reach. He wasn't going to be taken alive. When the agents breached the front entrance, the air filled with the thunder of gunfire. Underhill fired first, hitting one officer in the arm. The room lit up with flashes of light and the staccato bark of Thompson submachine guns. Wood splintered, plaster exploded from the walls. Underhill moved from room to room, returning fire while dragging his damaged leg behind him. He hit another officer in the side. A shotgun blast grazed the wall near his head, and a bullet tore into his shoulder. Still, he kept going. He moved toward the rear of the house, crawling now, leaving a trail of blood across the floor. He made it to the back door, kicked it open, and ran into the alley beyond. Bullets followed him, slamming into the fence posts and ricocheting off trash cans. He limped into the shadows, wounded but not yet dead. The agents secured the house and followed the trail. For several blocks, they searched, lights cutting through the dark, dogs sniffing the alleyways. Then they lost him. Somehow, again, he had vanished. But he was not far. Underhill had collapsed inside a furniture store a few blocks away. He had kicked in the rear door and dragged himself behind a row of sofas. There, in the dim light, he wrapped his bleeding shoulder with a curtain and tried to stay conscious. His breath came in rattled gasps. His shirt clung to him, soaked with blood. He was dying, and he knew it. Later that morning, the owner of the furniture store arrived and found him sprawled on the floor, barely awake but still clutching a pistol. The man backed away, called the police, and within minutes, the store was surrounded. This time, Underhill had no strength left to fight. He was taken into custody and transported under heavy guard to the Oklahoma State Penitentiary Hospital in McAlester. There, doctors worked to stabilize him, removing bullets from his chest and abdomen. But it was clear he would not survive. Infection had already spread, and his organs were failing. For nearly a week, he lay in a hospital bed, his body bound by restraints, his breath shallow and labored. Federal agents came and went, hoping for a confession or a statement. Underhill said nothing. Sometimes his eyes were open. Sometimes he mumbled to people no one else could see. Most of the time, he remained silent, staring at the ceiling as if watching something play out that only he could understand. On January 6, 1934, at the age of 32, Wilbur Underhill Jr. died. There was no fanfare, no public mourning. His body was processed and prepared for transport. He was returned to Joplin, Missouri, the place where his story had begun. He was buried in Peace Church Cemetery, a quiet, unadorned graveyard on the outskirts of town. His burial was private. No eulogies were given. No headlines marked his return. His grave is modest, with a simple marker that offers no hint of the violence and notoriety that defined his life. The legacy of Wilbur Underhill Jr. is one of contradiction. To the authorities who chased him across state lines, he was a relentless killer. To some in the criminal underworld, he was a tactician, a man who could escape any prison and outthink his pursuers. To the public, he was terrifying, faceless, fast, and always a step ahead. But unlike Dillinger, Bonnie and Clyde, or Pretty Boy Floyd, Underhill never achieved the romantic status that turns criminals into legends. He did not pose for cameras. He did not offer charming quotes to reporters. He killed when he needed to, escaped when he could, and never apologized for the life he lived. He was not interested in becoming famous. He wanted control. He wanted freedom. He wanted to outlast the men who built the walls meant to contain him. His life marked a turning point in American law enforcement. The manhunt for Underhill helped accelerate the arming of federal agents, the expansion of FBI authority, and the development of more sophisticated interstate communication between police departments. In many ways, he forced the system to grow stronger. He revealed its weaknesses and showed just how fragile the old methods of policing had become. Yet for all his notoriety, Joplin does not remember him. There are no plaques, no museum displays, no walking tours stop by his gravesite. His story, once shouted in headlines and whispered in backrooms, has faded into the quiet hum of local history. He is a figure relegated to old crime files, faded newsprint, and aging wanted posters. And maybe that's as it should be. For all the fascination his story invites, for all the lessons his life offers, Wilbur Underhill was not a hero. He was not misunderstood. He was a man who chose violence, who took lives, and who turned every opportunity for redemption into another chapter of destruction. But he was also a reflection of his time, a product of poverty, failed institutions, and the hard lessons of survival. He was not created in a vacuum. He emerged from a nation reeling from depression, gripped by fear, and searching for structure in a world that seemed to be unraveling. His grave lies beneath the soil of a town that once feared him, then forgot him. His story remains, not for celebration, not for sympathy, but as a mirror held to the past, a reminder of what can grow in the silence when no one is listening, when no one intervenes, when a boy becomes a shadow, and the shadow becomes a storm.